explain your role in the Kansas City, Missouri School District from 1971 to 1997?
Well, I first came to Kansas City in 1980, and my daughter didn't start to attend school in probably till 83 or 84. And so I got engaged then just as a parent, being involved. And then my organization, the National Black United Front, had an initiative that started in 1985 around the question of multicultural education and education of inclusion. And it started out of an event that took place in Portland, Oregon, where you had a desegregation effort going on. And as part of that, the only elementary school that had a majority African American population and had historic roots in the community was going to be closed. And so the struggle came for, well, if we're going to disperse our children, we want them to still have a sense of purpose and who they are. And with a demonstrations that took place by our local organization there in the community, they came up with this question of having baseline essays and multicultural education. Before that, no one was even talking about that. And out of that, that movement sparked attention around the country. And so here we were in Kansas City facing a very similar situation, a desegregation program going on, a disruption within the community. And we were looking for a way of making sure that our children, in terms of who they are, their potential, their history, their culture, wasn't going to be just kind of lost in the politics and in the shuffle of the school district. So I became engaged at that time, and now we're talking probably 1985, 1986 in a very active way. Well, as you recall, Kansas City started with a concept of trying to have a regional solution that even spilled over into other school districts outside of Kansas City, Missouri, and that was thrown out, and it was brought down to a more narrow focus of how this situation was going to be managed. And at that point, integration became a question of attracting white students back into the Kansas City School District. And in so doing, offering plans, programs, initiatives, themes that were basically designed to attract parents, white parents, to bring their children into the Kansas City School District. So Kansas City took that approach to it. And I don't think that was the original goal, but that's how it started. And with that, a host of contradictions and confusions happened in that process.
And what were some of those contradictions and confusions that you would list?
Well, first of all, the children who were the adjudicated victims of segregation became at the end of the line again. In other words, we had white children who were being bussed in and cabbed into the Kansas City School District. We had their parents making decisions on whether or not school was going to be classical Greek or Latin grammar or any of those. And our children essentially were on waiting lists. They were waiting to see if enough white parents would send their children to the school district, 40% before they could even get in. So there was that 60-40 split. Now, at that time, as you recall, it wasn't that you would just say if there are 100 seats, you're going to put 60 African-American children in, and you would wait to see if you could fill up to 40. That wasn't the case. You had to do it throughout the process. So if there were 10, it would have to be 6 and 4. And so many of our parents would, and I was experiencing this personally, I lived right down the street from Pinkerton Elementary School. When it became a magnet school, we had to wait. We didn't know if our daughters were going to be able to go back there. We had to wait to see what their ratio count was going to be. So we had that as one situation of frustration. And then it happened on some other levels, I think, that were many people may have missed. The concept of, and I believe the miss was, we thought integration was a goal as opposed to a means to an end. So we lost sight of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that if you would remind me. But what was happening in the process is that principals were getting that understanding, school leaders, and sometimes even up to the upper administrators, that you couldn't do anything that might discourage white parents from bringing their kids in the school district. So let me tell you some of the examples of what happened. There was a move to not celebrate Dr. King's Day. Because there was this feeling that if you celebrated Dr. King's Day, it would be focusing in on an African American, and white students would feel uncomfortable, so we wouldn't do that. There was schools that stopped celebrating Black History Month. And the same thing, in fact, they said, well, let's not call it Black History Month, let's just call it Brotherhood Month. And I remember Walter Marks, as superintendent, having to send out a directive to all principals saying, we will celebrate Dr. King's birthday, we will celebrate Black History Month with its integrity intact. And I remember students at Lincoln High School walked out, and students at Van Horn walked out, and East walked out, and even at Southeast, because of these contradictions that were at play. So what you had was these students where they were the victims of segregation, without a doubt, and they were being victimized again by a process that I think got very heavily focused on integration as a goal, as opposed to a means to an end. Well, the community responded to these efforts in ways that I thought were pretty much on target. I remember going down to school board meetings, and there were several of us down there, and Clinton Adams, who you know, was kind of a lone voice down at the school board meeting, advocating for change. And so we went down meeting after meeting after meeting, trying to get the board to understand that the process itself was actually placing our children in a situation where they didn't feel good about themselves. Parents were feeling like they were second-class citizens in a process that we thought was all about benefiting their educational outcomes of their children. And so we did some pretty radical things. We got to a point where we said, okay, we're just going to shut down school board meetings. And so we started shutting down school board meetings. And it got to a point where a negotiation took place. And in this negotiation, we sat down with administrators and the superintendent at that time and said, well, what do you all want? We're under a federal mandate to get these magnet schools up and going. What do you want? And this is what we said we wanted. One, we wanted an opportunity to name the schools. And so schools that wound up with names like Paul Robeson and Satchel Paige came from this effort to name the schools so that you would have some African American men and women who our children could look up to because the schools would carry their names. The other thing we said is we want some magnet schools that focus in on the history and the culture of our children so that they would feel a sense of ownership and place in an environment where they were being lost. And just to give you a little context for that, my daughters were had been attending Pinkerton, and Pinkerton was becoming a Latin grammar school. So what happened during that process, our principal, Marie Grant, was sent away for a year of training. A new principal came in, an interim, and that principal was Audrey Millard. And for that year, we watched as the transition took place where all of the photos and pictures were being removed and statues of Romans were being placed in there. Now we're saying, wait a minute, our children had pictures they could look and see themselves, and now we've got these classic Roman pictures and statues from the Latin grammar kind of thing in there. So they're being told that they're really not important. And so we pressed on that issue, and what we came out with negotiating was, and this is what Superintendent George Garcia, is that we would take 3 elementary schools, magnet schools, and we would focus in on the history, culture, and contributions of African Americans so that our children in those environments would not get lost. And those became the African-centered schools. Was a response out of that. Now there were other responses, but that one was very tangible because it provided an opportunity to have something done that was not going to be done otherwise. And I recall having a discussion in a forum with Sue Fulson, who was the school board president at that time. And we asked her, wait a minute, you have all these themes. You got French, German, Latin, classical Greek, all these European-based themes, but the overwhelming majority of the students are African American, and not only that, they're the victims of segregation. Why don't you have something that focuses in on who they are? And I'll never forget her response. Her response was, nobody's ever brought that up. So we brought it up. And Dr. Garcia was sensitive to the concerns, and he was also sensitive to the fact that Latino students would also be getting lost in the process. And he says, if you guys succeed with this, then we can expand this and pick up and the Latino population as well and make this thing work for everybody. So we had the support of the superintendent and support of the administration and some support of the board, and we were off and running. And that was our way to respond to what we saw happening. If you don't mind, I want to go back to this question of seeing integration as a goal as opposed to as a means to an end. I think the whole concept of integration as we saw this develop in the South and in the North was that our children, African American children, were not getting the adequate and equivalent resources, equitable resources that you would get in other schools. That books, materials, we just weren't getting those. And because we were segregated geographically, elected officials, school board members could decide not to send resources to those locations. It wasn't just the school district. It happened in the city and the county and the state as well. So those who were involved in that movement, they believed, look, if we could just have our children in the places where the resources are being allocated, then they would naturally benefit from that. Well, in Kansas City, we had a situation where the resources were being allocated. The only problem is our children weren't benefiting from it because they were not looked upon as being important in terms of who they were. So we said, you know what? The goal really was we wanted our children to leave school with an intellectual curiosity and maturity, with the skills necessary to be able to manage in this environment and economy, and a sense of self, who they are, and what is their role going forward in the world. And to do that and have adequate resources, it didn't really matter if the entire environment was integrated. As long as we didn't have state-sponsored segregation of resources, we could move on. And so we took those opportunities, given the environment that we were in, to make it happen. Well, I think the attitude about integration got to a point where we got to make this happen no matter what. We have to attract white students into the school. And that actually got in the way of education. You know, I remember that at that point that we were involved, several of us were involved in a case where the state of Missouri, attempting to get out of or slow down the desegregation plan, asked us to testify in court in front of Judge Russell Clark. And the issue at that time was the school district wanted to take the remaining 17 elementary schools and magnetize them. That would have provided a full magnet coverage for all the schools. And here we were saying, look, Dr. Garcia, the 3 schools you gave us are not magnet schools, and we're operating a program. If that happens, what will happen to us? Well, the plan was to turn Chick School into an international studies schools. Lab was going to be changed into an Asian studies school. And I don't even recall what lab was going to be turned into, but none of them were going to be focused on what we were promised, the history and accomplishments of African Americans, Africans and African Americans. Mm-hmm. So we were the issue was we had to decide, should we oppose the expansion of the DSEG program just to protect our humanity and intellectual and cultural integrity? So we decided to do that. So we opposed the expansion of it because, again, it was really driven around, you know, we've just got to get white students in the seats and not looking at education in whole. When we were before Judge Russell Clark, I'd never forget this, Donna Jackson, who was a parent who was on the witness stand, and she was being cross-examined by Arthur Benson, who was a plaintiff's attorney at that time. And she was testifying on behalf of the state. And she asked the question, she said, why is it that we're doing all this and we're not focusing on the fact that our children really, this is all about them getting a quality education? And Judge Russell Clark, in a very supportive and a humble way, said to her, ma'am, I'm sorry, but according to federal law, you don't have a right to a quality education. You just have a right to being educated in a desegregated environment. And that was a game changer for us. Because at that time, the drive really was, we've got to get this environment desegregated, and any obstacle in our way or perceived in our way will have to be removed. So at that time, we became a target for Arthur Benson, the plaintiff's attorney. And it's some very interesting dynamics going on here. You got to remember, he was the attorney for the plaintiffs, and these are the African-American children who were the victims of segregation. And yet here you had a group of parents who were organizing around creating a safe space where our children wouldn't be victimized by being eliminated out of the educational process in terms of who they are, their accomplishment, their achievement. In other words, their person and humanity. And he took us on. And I never forget one of the comments he made. He said that, and we were saying, oh, well, at that time, the focus was, we're going to make these African-centered schools so we can develop our children. And he said, and quoted in the Kansas City Star, that African-centered education is anti-intellectual. And then we had something very important happen as well, is that the NAACP, which was certainly part of the whole effort to get school desegregation in place, they wound up in a position where they were opposing us as well. because they saw that if you do this, and if white parents feel that if my child is in an environment where African children are being honored and celebrated, they won't want to be there. Therefore, that could wreck the whole deseg movement. Then they were acting accordingly. Now, the state did something quite interesting. The state came in with a survey that they had taken, where they actually asked not only white parents, but African American parents what themes they would like and which ones would they support. So the state presented evidence that said 78% of the white parents polled would not be opposed to having their children in a school that focused on the contributions of African and African Americans. And they also talked about what African American parents would want for their children in a magnet theme. And of them, 95% were favorable of being in an environment where the history and culture of African Americans and Africans would be supported. Now, what makes that so interesting is that the state reported at that time that prior to their survey, no African American parent had ever been polled about what themes should be placed in the Kansas City School District. And in one sense, it makes sense, it's logical. It was assumed that we would show up anyway. The only people important to be polled were the folks you were trying to attract, white parents. So the issue there was that the fight was on, not around just integrating, but about cultural integrity and human integrity of the folks who had been, continuously assaulted and victimized by the institution of education. Well, I just recall the attitudes from my own daughters, who were very excited about going to school, and then when the school turned over, it was like it wasn't really their school any longer. They were wearing Catholic school uniforms, and we're not Catholic. They've never attended a Catholic school. They're in a public school wearing Catholic school uniforms. I recall the attitude for students that were in the so-called black core schools, the traditional schools, where they didn't even get the resources for that the other schools got. So there was still a two-tier system. And then when we were at J.S. Chick School, which again was a traditional school, but one of the ones we were allowed to put an African-centered initiative in place, we thought, and the parents and the faculty came together and said, you know what, it's probably better if we have our own uniform. And it was called Dress to Success, and they wanted, and it broke down some of the kind of the economic class barriers, that all the children dress alike, and it was a great concept. When we took it before the school board and said, we want to, of our own, pay for our children to have uniforms, they voted us down. They said, you're not a magnet school, you can't take that on. That is not something we want you to do. And it was because there was a two-tier system. You can't even act like a magnet school. That's for them. You don't get that. We didn't take that laying down. Of course, we forced the issue and we dressed our students up anyway. And after a while, the board relented and backed up. The question was, what is parent engagement? Parent engagement was only viable and recognizable if it followed the pattern of desegregation. If you were out here in the black quarter, if you will, in a traditional school, it didn't mean anything. Parent engagement didn't mean anything. It just meant you were a nuisance. You were someone who didn't want to get with the program. That devalued all of our students because people carry those attitudes into the classrooms with them. I don't know what I contribute to school integration. Again, because integration, if you think of integration as a destination, as a goal, we didn't contribute very much to it at all. If you think of it as a means to an end, and that is to making sure that all children, particularly African American children, receive an education that would empower them, that would give them a sense of mission and purpose, we contributed to that, I would say, significantly. More so than schools that actually met their desegregation quota and had their racial balance they were looking for. Because in those schools, our students were, they were bit players. They were the ones who were receiving the benefits. They weren't the ones with agency. They were just following along, and it was for the others that were being brought in. So I guess we would have done very little, but hopefully we did a lot to get people to realize that it really was, historically was, and should have been merely just a means to an end. So in other words, you could get to a point and you could say, well, desegregation failed in Kansas City. But the next question, or the first question anyone should ask you is, but how did the children do? Were they educated? Were the parents happy with the product we had? So it could be reversed. And you and I both know parents who have sent their children outside of the Kansas City school district in schools that were African Americans, a very small percentage of the population, high performing schools, and their children do poorly and feel bad about themselves. Now you can brag and say, well, my daughter went to a prestigious school. But if your daughter finished that school not wanting to go any further, or feeling bad about themselves, or feeling disconnected from their own community, then the battle was lost.
So in your mind, that second goal did not have a lot of focus in terms of educational excellence?
No, I think it was, again, going back to Judge Clark, it wasn't the focus at all. It was a secondary issue. It wasn't until the so-called Milliken II remedies were looked at further on down the line that people said, we ought to be educating people while we're going through all this process. So initially, and during the period that we're focusing here on today, I didn't see any evidence of that. Not to the degree that you were focusing on the students who really needed it the most, who were really victimized by state-supported and sponsored segregation. No, I didn't see that. And I'm convinced, just from my own personal experience, that was definitely not the focus. The efforts to integrate the school, because they were so focused on numbers, so focused on getting white students in buses and cabs and bringing them into the school district, what you saw is some creaming, if you will. You would see parents that would say, you know what, and white parents that would say, you know what, they've got free pre-K programs in the school district that are pretty good. I'm going to send my kids to the school district, and then by the time they get to kindergarten, I'm going to move them someplace else. So you saw that taking place. And the district, to some degree, saw that as a success. Well, if we can just keep building off of this. But they didn't see what was being done to really bring up our students in terms of their sense of empowerment and educational grasp for skills and knowledge and desire to learn. We were working on that and bringing that up, but that was always the enemy. And when an institution is at war with its own mission, then we know we've got a state of mass confusion. So the process of integration really created more mass confusion than it did in terms of reaching the stated goal, and that was to have racial balance within the school district. And I don't want to be too hard on them. It was a very, very tall mountain to climb in the first place, given the racial segregation that exists in Kansas City around housing. I mean, it was going to be difficult, but that didn't make it any easier. But to make that your goal in that environment meant that you were going to have to be distracted and not focus on a number of other things that actually would have helped your mission. And you know what? That shouldn't have made me feel bad, because I lived on 66 in Agnes, in an area that's probably 98% African American. I shouldn't feel bad because that's where I live. For someone to say your area is never going to be integrated, so we're not going to be paying any attention to sending resources there. So now all of a sudden, I mean, it's no different than segregation, right? Than state-sponsored segregation. Because you are where you are and who you are, then we're going to skew resources away from you.
You're not going to get as much money.
That's right. Well, I recall from that period, it was mainly the Iowa test of basic skills was the test that was out there that was used as a yardstick to determine whether or not our students were learning. And I remember there was a lot of frustration around that, and the focus of testing. And the district wasn't doing very well. And it made sense because that wasn't really the focus. There was some increase happening because you were bringing in students from a different educational experience who were doing better. And when those students came in, you would get a bump because of that. But I think their parents began to realize that they were on a downward slide after a while because of the focus in the environment really wasn't academically rigorous or challenging. And those terms are thrown around a lot. They don't really mean as much to me as they used to. We're at UMKC right now, and you have a program for training medical doctors. I can go sit in that classroom, and they could be very academically rigorous and challenging, and I'm a reasonably educated person, and I can read and write. But I'm not going to do well because the systems of support, the context, the background that I need in order to help me be successful, I don't have it. And so when we're creating these environments of academic rigor they were doing, there was no support underneath that so that our students can be successful. And a lot of that has to do with the context, the why. Where do I fit in this? Why are we doing this? How do I see my life changing because of it? All of that was lost. And it was essentially, hey, we got this rigorous curriculum, put people in these classrooms, and we just teach at them, and my goodness, they're going to blossom. Well, it didn't happen. But the students who had that experience someplace else that came in, I think that helped more to moving the numbers than actually, the indigenous population actually been lifted up. So my understanding and experience of that was that it was a real struggle around there. I would test the basic skills, and we weren't really doing that well. The stated outcomes is that you get people with different backgrounds in a classroom, then they will have an opportunity to exchange and get to know each other, and we will lessen some of the misunderstandings and hostilities that we would have because people are ignorant of each other's background and culture. Okay. You got to start with the teaching staff first. I don't know what happened of any substance that would have gotten the teaching and administrative staff to understand that concept. But that concept goes beyond, I think, and there's some unwritten things, but when you set up a environment that says, what's important is classical Greek, what's important is Latin grammar, what's important is Asian studies and all of that. When you set up an environment that says that, you're automatically telling students of our background, what you're not important. And so now I'm disadvantaged in an environment where everyone else is being celebrated. So the outcomes, I would think, would cause frustration. And then when we saw with the students who revolted at East High School and Southeast High School and Van Horn, and even students at Lincoln a little later on actually got on board and were beginning to revolt against what was going on, then they weren't feeling valued in that environment. The discussion was happening around them, but it didn't engage them. I think we should have taken a step back and said, you know what, this is a goal. If we don't achieve integration in a school district that was hyper-segregated, in a neighborhood that were hyper-segregated, in an environment from the start, that these obstacles, then what is the best that we can get out of this so that these students come out of here as change agents, changing the environment from their own communities and themselves and having an impact on the greater world. What can we do? How can we equip them? If we had looked at that in terms of when they come out of here, what kind of impact can they have on the greater world to bringing about the kind of change that we all thought was important, I think we would have empowered and we'd have created a generation that would have been powerful. But we didn't do that. We got locked into the box that says, here's the confines. What you have in here is of little value, but who you bring in will determine the resources you get. And if you can't keep them, in other words, if you can't do what can't be done by the entire weight of the United States government, if you can't do what has not been done by the entire weight of the state of Missouri in Jackson County, then you're a failure. And those children had to bear the brunt of that. So what could have been done? We should have stepped back and said, what's the most we can do? And we should have remembered those who actually fought the long, hard fights in Kansas City and around this country around desegregation. And that was the ending of state-sponsored allocation of resources based on race. That's what that was about. And if we had remembered that that was what they fought for, then we would have understood that what we were given, if we could, gave us an opportunity to do so much more than what we attempted to do with a really, really stacked deck. To be honest with you, I've lost faith in today's urban schools. And my experience, I'm very jaded, and my experience has been a very terrible one. Because it looks like the institutional structure is set up to produce exactly what we get. If there was ever an opportunity to say, show me operational crazy in action, we can say, well, here's education, public education around the country. They do things the way they've always done it, and they're just completely frustrated that the outcomes aren't different. So here's the thing, you and I can get on a plane, we can go to KCI, and we can fly to Seattle. We can fly down to Los Angeles. We can stop in Reno, Nevada. We can fly out to Miami. We can go to New York and go to Indianapolis, and it doesn't matter. If we go into an environment where we have large African American populations in the school district, we're dealing with different parents, different children, different state laws, but the outcomes are the same. When that is the case, it usually falls to the fact that the institutional structure is what's causing it. It's not the parents, not the teachers, not the anything other than the fact that we're using the same institutional model, and it's producing identical outcomes. That's where we need to change. And unfortunately, I believe that who we have on school boards and administrators and superintendents and principals, they're locked into that. And their livelihoods count on that. And anytime they talk about something that relates to real substantive change, people get fearful of that. And so it's easier to complain that we're working hard and things aren't getting better than it is to change. I'd give up on school integration in Kansas City and really focus in on educating children in Kansas City. And then let those children go about to make the kind of change in the community that it will take to really break down structures of institutional racism. You're not going to do it from the school by itself. It can't happen that way. We're not going to change and make the school different than American society. What we can do is create students who can go out and change American society.